Okay, everyone, ready, set. Welcome, everyone, to our panel, Imagining Accessible Worlds. I'm Dr. Jen Rinaldi. I'm an associate professor at Ontario Tech University, and I am the series and event organizer. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the university hosting this event, Ontario Tech, is proud to acknowledge the lands and peoples of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation. And we are thankful to be welcome on these lands in friendship. The lands are situated on and covered by the Williams Treaty and are the traditional territory of the Mississaugas. That's a branch of the Greater Anishinaabe Nation, which includes Algonquin, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. These lands remain home to many Indigenous nations and peoples. I should note, my apologies for forgetting, I use the pronouns she, her, and hers. And for a visual description, I am a white woman with glasses and pixie cut. I'm wearing my black axolotl print dress today. And the background contains a white wall with my couch and bookcase and plants. I'm so excited to be joining you for what is part 2 of our 4-part virtual speaker series, which is called Advocates Assembly, Disability Research from the Ground Up. This series is hosted by the Institute for Disability and Rehabilitation Research, which was established in partnership with Ontario Tech University and the Canadian Memorial Chiropractic College. The Institute, IDRR, is committed to conducting applied research that is relevant to policymakers involved in disability and rehabilitation. In this vein, this series is meant to connect disability and rehabilitation researchers to community-based research principles and goals. So in this series, disability justice activists and disability-centered service providers are speaking to the lived experience in community conditions and most pressing needs of disability populations. And they're doing so in an effort to frame the future of disability and rehabilitation research. I should note that this project is funded with a Social Science and Humanities Research Council Connection grant. We are so grateful to SLIAO for providing ASL translation tonight, and the Canadian Hearing Services for providing live captioning. Maybe a business note is it would be great if everyone kept their cameras off for the duration of the presentation to limit visual content. And when we get to the Q&A, if there's time for it, I would suggest you turn on your camera. If you're interested in speaking, you raise your hand. I can walk you through how to do that. And you're welcome to turn on your mic then to pose your question. Or to be translated through our translators if you need that service. You're also welcome to pose questions through the duration of the talk using the chat window. And we'll make an effort to read those questions aloud. I did also want to note that we are very grateful to the artist who provided material, provided the commissioned and original art for our project poster. That is Rana Adwala. And you can find, I can provide the link in the chat, but you can find in our alt text to our poster and in the tail end of our registration page, a link to her online store if you want to shop her materials and support disabled artists. And I did also want to note that given this is part 2 of a 4-part series, we do have an event upcoming called Centering Disability in Healthcare on November 2nd at 12 noon to 1:30 Eastern Standard Time. So stay tuned in your email, and I'll try to post a link to the poster in the chat if you would like to register for that event as well. Okay, all the business aside now, let's get to the main event. I have the distinct pleasure of moderating this talk with some really excellent experts in our field. I am very happy to leave you ladies to the introduction work yourselves, because the list that I would have for providing your credentials would be long indeed. So maybe my first question to you, and feel free to decide who wants to go first. We'll just take a moment to shift spotlights. I'm wondering if you would like to introduce yourself. You are welcome to identify an organization or institutional affiliation. If you want, you can provide your visual description as well as an accommodation feature. And then the sort of broader question is, so we can dive right in, maybe you'd like to reflect upon your contributions to disability and rehabilitation research so that people know where you're situated in the field. Who would like to go first?
I can start. And by the way, I've been using the touch screen to admit people. I don't know if it looks like I've been repeatedly giving you the finger, but that slow down. So I'm a woman, a white woman who's going to be a senior in a few months. Have short gray hair as of this morning. I wear glasses. And I'm wearing a gray sweater. And I'm in a room that looks mostly dark behind me, which is my home. I'm executive director of the Empowerment Council, which is a systemic advocacy organization entirely run by and for peers. So we represent people with mental health and addictions issues. I founded and worked for the Empowerment Council and before it, the Queen Street Patients Council. So I've been doing this advocacy work in the ever-changing named currently MAD community for about 30 years. I accept all the terminology other than mentally ill because it's got a biomedical implication. Other than that, service user, consumer survivor, MAD, all psychiatric survivor, all of those terms I use and are fine for me to hear. My organization has done a great deal of advocacy in judicial surroundings and at inquests and at the Supreme Court. We've also done research work and have been involved in a few studies as partners and some knowledge translation work before that. And I'm thinking I'll save any details for the discussion.
Thank you so much for kicking us off. Let's see, Jen. I'm just playing with the spotlights as I go. Maggie or Fran, would you like to go next?
I can go next if that's okay.
I'd love that.
Great. I'm Fran Odette, and I go by she, her, them, or they pronouns. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you here tonight, and thank you to Dr. Rinaldi for this opportunity. Maybe a little bit about myself, visual description. I'm a wheelchair user. I have short gray hair, glasses that are dark rimmed, and I'm wearing a brown sweater, and I'm sitting in my home office. And a little bit about myself. I am queer identified, cisgender, white settler, living with a disability, as I mentioned earlier. And I also am at a time in my life where I might be considered an elder of sorts. And I've been an educator and trainer, around issues of access and equity and inclusion work for about 25 years, mostly looking at the intersections of disability and gender and sexuality. Maybe I'll save sort of a little bit about my work later and turn it over to Maggie.
Great, thank you very much. My name is Maggie Doherty Gilbert. I go by she, her. I am a white female. I am definitely a senior. I'm way up there. I have red hair and freckles, and I have sort of red colored glasses on tonight. A little bit about my background. I've been in the field since 1981. I myself am hard of hearing, and every day I have to deal with the repercussions of not being able to hear. I do use hearing aids, and I rely on either interpreters or captionists. I started back in the field, as I said, in 81, and saw the tremendous barriers to folks who have difficulty, especially around hearing loss. I worked very closely with David Lepofsky back in the early 2000s, up until 2005, where he and MPP Jackson and I took on Queen's Park, and we really advocated for the legislation. I've been in a lot of the Hansard reports because I was constantly battling the politicians to try to have some legislation in place. I've worked in every gamut of the organization. I was at CHS for 22 years. I retired in 2015. And then I started volunteering with Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario. And in 2018, I took over the agency where I'm at now, Durham Deaf Services. And now I am going to go back into retirement now that I've established the agency. I've worked in all parts of accessibility, from vision to hearing loss to cognitive issues. I've worked with politicians, healthcare providers. I'm actually interested in your healthcare session that's coming up next, because that's my biggest frustration, is the lack of accessibility in healthcare. So I will leave it at that. I'm sure there'll be lots of things I can contribute later, and I'll turn it back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, all three. Maybe I'll just note that we did have a fourth speaker in mind, but she did have to send her regrets tonight. So now you have met all of your panelists for the evening, and now you have a sense of where they're situated and their credentials. I suggest that we launch into a conversation, in which case I'm happy to move on to the next panelist prompt. My question for you three is, what should community-based research look like? And I'm wondering what that looks like from start to finish. And an addendum to that, what are some examples from your own experience of challenges and strategies for success when it comes to knowledge generation in the field of disability? Anyone want to take a first stab?
I could go first again. I'll start out with my experience just so sequentially. I started off, well, I was a research assistant when I was first working in the mental health area. And so, and I used to TA a course at U of T in the Women's Studies program that taught students how to differentiate good and bad science. So I never thought science was the enemy. And that's one of the things I really tried to communicate to my community. I sort of held some accessible science. I think somebody might need to mute. Oh, there we go. Because I think a lot of people had felt more like lab rats as far as science went, and as if science has only ever resulted in people being treated with biomedical procedures. And my perspective with it, all we want is what genuinely helps. And the trouble is we're getting a biased version of that. So the better the science is, and the more inclusive and community-based it is, the better off we're going to be. So I used science as part of a great advocacy project, gathering together all the materials that supported our position opposing some new legislation that was going to be introduced that would limit the rights of people, or take away the rights of people with mental health history. So that most of the peer organizations across the province were fighting this. And so I supplied sort of a 2-page handout of scientific articles that supported this being unnecessary, that there's more, that there were non-coercive alternatives that were actually more effective. So, and the list of resources was quoted when the Parliament debated it. We did win the first round in Parliament, but then we lost the second. And then since then, the Empowerment Council has been very involved in conducting, as partners, qualitative research primarily. So I advocated for a community-based research advisory committee at the Center for Addiction Mental Health, which, sorry, I'm talking too quickly, which we got, but was not treated in a meaningful way. The community wasn't really allowed to have significant input or impact. So people just got frustrated and dropped off the committee. And while some community researchers did try to involve the community, the worst situation was with the biomedical researchers who could see no role for the involvement of the community in setting research questions or analyzing research. So we were involved, the research we were involved with was looking at collaborative care, how people with mental health or substance use issues are treated in emergency departments and by physicians, how people with mental health and addiction issues perceive the influences that shorten our lives. Then as for what community-based research should look like, I actually, the committee created 2 handouts that might be useful for me to share. I'm sorry I didn't think of it until I was just answering these questions last night. One is for community on how to be involved with researchers, and the other is for researchers on how to involve community. So I can get those both to you. So in addition to the points that are in the handout, which cover things like ensuring that people are involved every step of the way, and setting research questions, analyzing research results, interpreting the research findings. It's also, and that this be a constant check-in process that not just sort of be done once and assumed to be working. And as part of the process that makes this all work, it's important for the peers who are involved to have some opportunities to talk amongst themselves, because often people are intimidated to share a way that they're feeling excluded or marginalized or sidelined, especially if they feel like they don't have the science background that other people in the room do. So it's important for the people partnering in the research to talk, peers to talk amongst themselves, and also when conducting the research, it's a good opportunity to have peers do the interviews, if the research involves interviews, with peers without there being someone present who is involved with mental health services. I found that you can get such completely different information. That I was in a room when somebody said, oh, I got such great service here. I'm really grateful for it. Then the nurse who was in the room left the room. He said, she is a nightmare. Everyone is afraid of her. It was horrible here. So it's not just a little difference that you might get. And I think that often the traditional perspective is that if you include the community perspective, you're going to get bias. But I'm of the opinion that instead you're going to get a fuller picture, and you're going to get perspectives that wouldn't occur to you, or I'm using you in a way that may not apply to a lot of people here, but let's just assume you're scientists, all of you without a personal background in disability. So you'll get perspective that that might not occur to you in terms of questions to ask, ways to understand the information that you get, what to do with the information that you get. And I think that it's going to be broader than the traditional way of not including that perspective, which actually does tend to introduce bias because you don't have as broad a perspective. And I think that when including people and doing the research, as well as seeking out diversity within the group that you're looking at, it's also important to have some representation from organizations within the community, because they can often speak from a broader perspective than what sometimes happens, a kind of random selection of individuals who the researcher just happens to encounter. Another example of people feeling sort of safe by having peers being involved with the research project was when I was conducting a focus group of people in the forensic system, which is the judicially sourced part of the mental health system. And people weren't really responding at all when I was asking questions. So I started talking a bit more about myself and about the rights, the rights work I've done. And they said, oh, you're on our side. And then they started talking about their experience. I'll stop there for now.
What a wonderful way in. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Maggie or Fran, would you like to go next?
Maybe I can build on what Jennifer has also said. And I guess in terms of thinking about community-based research, I think our work is really, I mean, my background has been doing research in the context of anti-violence work and the impact for female identified folks living with disabilities. And that includes members of the deaf community and also children as well living with disabilities. And also then looking at intersections of sexuality and disability and aging in the context of healthcare. So just kind of a context around where I'm coming from. And I think what I'm hopeful of is that for all of you who are here, and as Jennifer had mentioned, that you may not necessarily be scientists, but if you are interested in doing work with, the community or members of communities, I think it's really important to think about the need to shift the real power imbalance that does exist between persons that have access to research and those of us who are often the subjects. So to be able to, bring in a sense of collaboration and also to create this work from a place of co-creation. I think that's really, what we need to start thinking about around disrupting very real power imbalances in this work. I would also think that we want to have and ensure that we're all, working with communities that are co-researchers from a place of mutual respect and collective action. So the work that I've done in the past has been, really trying to participate in the work from an equal status and meaningful engagement, that I'm not just a token, or that other members of the research team are not brought on simply to to play a role in supporting the research by simply saying, well, we had members on the team with lived experience, but that we are actually involved in the work and in the design and in the research process at all aspects. Another thing that I have really experienced, though it has been, few and far between, I have to be honest, but is when non-disabled researchers approach the work from a place of allyship. I think more and more researchers that are interested in community-based research need to really think about that beyond the work of the grant, but to really think about, their own understandings of disability, and recognizing it's not universal. It's not something that that is widely known. It's mostly a term that we take up here in a sort of the North American context, but in some communities, Indigenous communities, there isn't even language to talk about disability. And so, again, recognizing that it's not necessarily something everybody comes to from the same place. And I think that, when we want to think about inclusion, I think it's important to remember that not everybody coming to the table is going to have had the years of experience that perhaps other researchers might have. And so, there may be a bit of a learning curve. And how do we bring people along so that we're not leaving anyone behind? How do we ensure that we are creating opportunities for people to learn and be engaged, and to be able to go on to other kinds of work that might be research related, because we want to center people's lived experiences and being sort of the experts of our lives within the context of disability justice and anti-oppression work. So, instead of just, sort of talking the talk, how do we actually really embrace it from the ground up? And that our lives aren't just in the pages of the reports, but continue to be sustained after the research is done. So I'll leave it at that for now, and I'll turn it over to Maggie.
So the beauty of going third is both speakers eloquently, Fran and Jennifer, have talked about statistics and research, which is not the house that I come from. I'm more of the lived experience of working in the front lines, doing research with mental health programs through Canadian Hearing Society, and working with legislation and with officials. And from that, I see a big disconnect between the research and the action. You also, both of you mentioned about the empowerment of the individual. And sometimes that gets lost, it's just research or theory, and we don't think of who that's really impacting. I have seen it firsthand through my 20 some years at CHS, how folks who have issues they're not able to deal with and then have a hearing loss, specifically deaf, how it does sort of complicate things, and the plan of care is not really what would be humanely expected. I see a big disconnect between that for sure. I also think that there has to be more involvement, and I'm sure you are involving all sorts of politics and leaders and legislation. And from my experience looking at it, that's where it falls short. We have in front of us, Charter of Rights and human rights, and we have 5 or 6 really big pieces of legislation that should ensure accessibility and disability. And still we're struggling with it. Every day we're struggling with it. I applaud you for doing the research. I applaud you for putting it on paper. And I'm hoping that it gets into an action statement, that those who are dealing with this every day and the barriers that we encounter are things that can be minimized through the tremendous research that's being done.
Oh, thank you so much for such a rich engagement with that question. What I'm hearing is that scientific research need not be at odds with community-based research principles, however much the researchers might resist actually doing work to learn about lived experience and connect to community. I'm hearing across these presentations that there are disconnects that researchers need to overcome in terms of engendering trust, in terms of communication, and in terms of accessing those who work on the front lines to ensure that our research is meaningful and actionable. And it sounds like that there are still profound power imbalances that researchers need to acknowledge and deconstruct so that we're not extracting from communities. We're actually trying to serve these communities and to ensure that research is directed in a way that can change policy and can make fulfilled, fully inclusive lives more possible. If we're happy with that engagement with my first question, I'd be more than happy to move on to the next. I don't know if anyone has any follow-up thoughts after those lovely turns, in which case.
It's Maggie. There's just some comments in the chat box about trying to empower our elected officials. DDS had our 40th anniversary last Thursday at the office. And I was very impressed that a lot of MPs and MPPs and local mayors came. And their lack of knowledge around accessibility and human rights was astounding. Of course, they all got up to speak, and each one of them said, "Oh, I learned a lot today." And it saddens me that we have to educate our elected officers about people who are differently able, about how we all need and require accessibility. And when you look at the population that we have who are quote unquote disabled, who are trying to accommodate, I was just mesmerized by all of these leaders. But it's true. The research is there, and we have to do the research, and we have to put it into action. But the people who are making decisions for and with us, those are the folks that we have to start getting them to understand some of the differences and some of the things that we all really need. If I go into a hospital and I need oxygen, I'm given oxygen. But if I go into a hospital and I need an interpreter, that's always questioned. And to me, it's such a shame. And when I look back at 2005, this legislation came into place that we should have an accessible community. Your research is helping, for sure. That's amazing. But we shouldn't still be fighting for the rights of individuals who have the right to access. So to your comment around the elected officials, there's a huge gap there in services and knowledge.
Something else that can happen with elected officials is that when they decide to sort of poll on a question to see what people think of it, they'll invite the people who provide services to the community of people rather than the people themselves, which is infuriating. When Toronto City Council was talking about developing crisis alternatives to police, initially they had listed an emphasis on the Black and Indigenous communities, which was wonderful, but they never mentioned involving the communities of people who had mental health histories, which is 100% of the people that they're going to be seeing. So I said, what other people would you do this with? Would you have an organization designed to entirely address women and only have male experts on women invited to participate? So now we're mentioned.
I'm wondering if I can just sort of add to this, if possible. Maggie, I appreciated you getting us started a little bit in terms of looking at the impact of how we don't involve community. One thing that sort of stood out for me is that I think as a result of what we've learned from COVID, from the pandemic, is that certainly some people's lives are seen as more valued than others. Oh, I'm sorry, folks. And so
Fourth
as a
panelist.
result, you know, to go into a hospital setting, not everyone is going to be treated equitably. Even the idea of having access to oxygen, not all of us will be considered in that discussion. I have no idea what's going on in the background, folks, but they're loving the conversation. But I think, sorry, let me just.
Yeah, that's bound to happen, Zoom.
Oh my gosh. But I guess what I wanted to say very quickly is this idea about distrust. And I think it is huge for many of us, you know, living with disabilities who are also wanting to be involved in the research and wanting to work and collaborate with non-disabled researchers. I think it's so imperative that non-disabled researchers do their work and have a better sense and understanding of our history and why many of us will, you know, be very clear about wanting to be involved in all parts of the research because of our history of exclusion, because of our history of segregation, and not being able to be active participants in decision-making about our own lives. And so thinking about that as well, whether it's health, whether it's, you know, in other kinds of areas, we really do need to be, you know, non-disabled researchers who don't have the history and the lived experience need to be doing some of that work as well. So I just wanted to add that.
Oh, wonderful. It's just, it's so deeply meaningful to hear about like this call to render the work inclusive, because our political and social worlds are so deeply historically exclusionary. So how do we co-create research? What it requires imagining what inclusion looks like when we're gathering this data. It means that we're elevating disabled people, so it's not just non-disabled people doing the studying and the learning and the advocating. It's how do we you know, become accomplices if we're talking about non-disabled researchers to ensure that like the very difficult and fraught work of inclusion is done through data collection and all the way up to making action possible. I just heard someone wanted to add to that, maybe.
It's just going to say, when speaking of inclusion, it's also important to be aware of intersectionalities. So, for example, partly because of the advocacy work I've done with police for so long, the anti-racism activists have really educated me about the importance of demographic data collection. So our organization pressed the Center for Addiction and Mental Health for years to collect demographic data on the use of force within the mental health system. Because it's assumed that the mental health system is the panacea for use of force in the judicial system, but mental health system also uses force. And as it turns out, when we finally got them to collect the demographic data, that it's used with racial bias. So people who are Black are 3 times more likely to be restrained than people who are white. This is not data that's collected at most mental health facilities, and it really needs to be.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. That's a really important and worthy nuance to the discussion around inclusion. My apologies about the additional noise in the background. I'm very happy to move on to the next question. And this is a sort of content-based question. I'm wondering what you think academic disability and rehabilitation research should prioritize in order to meaningfully meet community needs and expectations. So what are the sort of pressing needs in our communities right now that the research needs to shore up and really pay attention to.
Jen, I'm wondering if others would be okay with me just, I've been thinking a lot about that question before today. And, I think I want to recognize and acknowledge that as somebody who's been involved in research and also who is, from community, that there is, very much a place of multiple tensions between, sort of academia and rehabilitation research that focuses on the experiences of disability versus community-based research, which I think really does ideally center the voices of those most marginalized and impacted by systemic barriers in this culture. And so, and recognizing that we are the experts, which I think is a part of that tension going back to academia and rehabilitation, that there seems to be less of a focus on those who are the subjects as being the experts. That's not to say across the board. I think that's definitely changing. But I would also want to offer that I think as somebody who's a member of the community, multiple communities, and also involved in research, how do I resist the tendency of, not getting caught up in some of those dominant narratives? And what does it mean to who gets researched and who doesn't? Going back to Jennifer, your point about who's not captured in the demographics, whose stories are we not actually hearing about for folks that have been incarcerated within psychiatric facilities, within the jails. We know also that gender is a factor as well around responses to experiences of trauma and people's identification of mental health concerns. So, I think we need to think more critically about recruitment. How do we ensure that we're not leaving anybody behind? And that would be sort of a priority for me as I sort of negotiate these multiple worlds in the area of research.
An incredibly strong start. Thank you so much, Fran. Jennifer or Maggie, would you like to go next?
When I first started doing advocacy work 30 years ago, there was the first province-wide consultation that involved people who actually had experienced mental health issues. Partly because at the time there was an MPP, David Revel, who during the time the NDP were coming to power, himself was open about having a psychiatric history. And so when I saw the first copy of the results, and they said that two of people's major concerns were housing and income and employment, or three major concerns that people had. But then when it came out, when the final report came out, they had the income and employment had been replaced by case management. I was like, we meant our employment and our income. Okay, what happened with that? So that is still both cause and effect of people having disabilities, because it's very difficult to be well in any way if you are not housed at all, or if you're in some horrible housing. And it's also an effect. As we know, disability supports are pathetic, and getting housing in Toronto that's affordable for anybody is almost impossible. So that's huge. And I'm part of a GTA Disability Coalition. If anyone's interested, it's sort of organized out of Center for Independent Living in Toronto. And housing has certainly been one of the issues that we've identified as primary. And in the mental health system, the use of force in the mental health system has always been an issue for us. And so getting recognition for it, even when we got the use of restraints analyzed demographically, we still haven't, we got mechanical restraints analyzed and seclusion, but they left out chemical restraints because I think there's such a bias in favor of biomedical intervention that they're kind of refusing to see that that's an equally problematic restraint and equally, if not possibly more, inclined to reflect bias because it's easier to sort of hide. And I agree with somebody who said legislation is a way to force people to create data collection, but it's very difficult to mobilize politicians in favor of the rights of mad people. I've spoken to parliamentary committees who say, who I've told are writing legislation that violates the charter, but they don't actually care that much because they're not concerned about the mad vote.
Mm-hmm.
What incredibly pressing emergencies that needs a spotlight. Maggie, you might be last on our list.
I don't really have much to offer as far as, two very learned presenters here who can really speak to the research a lot better than I can. I just know that, when it comes to individuals who have disabilities, and as I say, I worked at CHS for a long time, and I saw how when families looked at someone who had, they could have a mental health issue and they also could have a hearing loss, how they were so discounted. And my 20 plus years was trying to advocate for rights and trying to advocate for families to be better educated. The research has to hit the pavement. It has to hit the politicians. It has to hit the community. When I see families that are so ignorant as far as the needs of their family members, and for the most part, they were adults, just because they're deaf and just because they have been diagnosed with another disability, it doesn't mean that they can't think or they can't feel. So the education is not only important in this research, what you're doing, but getting it out to the community, speaking in plain language that the community can understand the research that's happening, the ramifications, how we all can have a voice. Whether it's loud or soft, we all have the right to have a voice. And that's what's really missing. And one of the reasons I came out of retirement for this agency was to try to put this agency back on its feet because nobody really cared. United Way said that deafness was not a disability in the Durham region and they weren't going to fund the programs anymore. And that mortified me, and it's really about not only the research, but how does that education get out to the community? I'm a pretty smart person. I read research papers and often I look at a gap and go, what exactly did that mean? But let's put it out in plain language. I think more and more of that has to come into the communities, particularly the families that are supposedly providing supports for individuals within their families.
It's true. Getting the research out can really give ammunition for advocacy. I found that the research showing that lack of housing causes mental health issues, for example, I find is really important for housing advocacy because there's a narrative that goes, people who are mentally ill can't handle housing somehow. They're just beyond them to handle having housing, and that's why none of them are housed, as opposed to being homeless, creating a constant state of distress and destabilization in people. And there's certainly the research is there now to show that providing homes makes for better mental states. I also, by the way, really hate it when people say that deinstitutionalization has caused all the mad people out on the street. That's not what has caused it. It's lack of affordable housing. People shouldn't ever have been housed in institutions. But the money that used to go into institutions should have gone into housing supports and did not.
Oh my God, shout that from the rooftops. I feel that in my marrow as a researcher of institutional violence and how it spills into community, not because we shut down institutions, but because there's just no support. I really am so deeply grateful for these contributions, even when Maggie's self-deprecating, because there's something so important about imagining how to build megaphones so that disability communities have the ability to have their voices be part of important policy making conversations. And I really think about this. No one wants to hear me talk. Who wanted to contribute? I think I heard a sound.
As you're talking about this, what really impacted our community, the deaf community, was in COVID, when the premier would stand up and he would pontificate about pandemics and COVID and what we were doing. And it wasn't until myself and other deaf agencies got together and said, you need to have this interpreted. We have this huge community. And for you that know, and I know many of you do know, for people who are deaf and they use ASL, English is not their first language. Sure, they can understand the paper, they can understand what people are saying, but it's similar to French. They want it in their language. And the ignorance of politicians that none of this information, even though we have legislation, had to be conveyed in their first language. It was mind-boggling. And even the way the premier addressed the interpreter, and he was, very condescending and embarrassed the interpreter. Like, he didn't even have a clue how to deal with an interpreter. This is 2022, get with it. And then we have the fallout from within the Durham region alone. We have deaf seniors who didn't know what a platform was, who didn't know how to book anything online. So I was able to get some short-term funding through the Ministry of Health. And we literally went door to door in our region of people we knew were in those houses. And we brought tablets to them and showed them how they could start finding things online. To this day, there's still a huge gap in services for that disabled population, deaf seniors in the Durham region, who don't have a door to open because CHS has changed their service delivery, and that's fine, but they're not doing, you can't come to an office. So now we have this huge community that is struggling, and they're coming to our agency, which is not funded to provide support to seniors. So the ignorance around people who have a hearing loss around pandemic planning and information, it was just remiss. It wasn't even there. So it really, and I really want everyone to own this. I want everyone to own the ramp, to own the visual cues, to own the hearing cues, everything around making a person whole. I want people to own it. So these are the pillars of society. And it's not incumbent on me to have to advocate that, would you please interpret that, what you're saying. COVID was such a valuable part of information, and it fell short. And it fell short through, well, I know it did in Toronto too, because we also worked with some of the larger agencies in Toronto to get that translated. But there's an example here of a disabled community. There's no resources for them. They were just left out to dry.
Can I just add, Maggie, I really appreciated what you said. And I think, I think it's really important for this conversation to move beyond the folks who are part of disability communities, because I think access and inclusion is something that we don't ever think is going to involve other people, people who don't currently live with disability. And so if we actually have space that is more inclusive and accessible, it doesn't only just benefit the deaf community or folks that are using mobility devices or not identified. It means that we all get to participate. But we are so focused on access being for those folks over there, as opposed to for everyone, and how, the world could actually open up in so many different ways if we actually considered that at the beginning rather than as an afterthought. So thank you. I really appreciate, and I think the pandemic, as horrible as it was for so many people, there was something that shifted around people's thinking of access in multiple ways.
I'm so moved by the poetry in this exchange, this idea that access is about opening up our worlds, this idea that we all need to own the conditions that make a person whole. And I think my last research, or my last big question about disability and rehabilitation research is already being touched on here, because we're thinking about the importance of like making the work matter and enabling or ensuring that it reaches people through plain language, through using people's first language, and through accounting for the precarity and systemic barriers like reaching unhoused populations who will have a ton of barriers to, being able to, read our stuffy academic reports. Maybe this is a good opportunity for us to have an in-depth conversation around the last question I meant to pose. I'm wondering, how can disability and rehabilitation research communicate findings to key stakeholders in ways that advance public policy and produce meaningful transformation? So I really like this idea that we're imagining how to ensure the research reaches a community. And Fran has reminded us that access is bigger. So how do we make sure that our research is spreading in ways that reaches the people who have the power to make change?
I think that involving advocates when research is even being considered, or advocates involving researchers addressing the things that are really pivotal, are two ways to different sides to go about it, which can lead to both discovering areas of research that wouldn't usually be considered, and also sort of providing an analysis that could be applied to public policy. So to have people involved in figuring out the leap between the two. And I find that when releasing information publicly, if somebody's willing to talk about the impact that this research has on their own life, that the media always loves that. But I know it's kind of also it can be a problematic patient porn thing that happens, like show us your pain. So we have to really hit the right balance. I try to get people to say that that people with disabilities have an analysis of our own experience and the knowledge and understanding. It's not just a peekaboo show for others. So that people have to be seen in the broad sense that way.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jennifer. You're always keen and able to lead the conversation. I'm wondering if Fran and Maggie have thoughts next.
Maybe I can just sort of add to what Jennifer said, and that I'm actually left with more questions than answers, to be quite honest with you. And I think, one of the things that I would like us to think about is, sort of how to mainstream or academic rehabilitation disability stakeholders, critically think about the needs of a wide range of stakeholders, not only at this sort of end of the project where knowledge translation and knowledge sharing is occurring, but, throughout the whole process, as I had mentioned earlier. And so there's a place of transformation, and maybe I have a little bit of rose-colored glasses. I appreciate that. I'm always hopeful that there will be some kind of transformative experience that comes out of really meaningful, co-created, and the centering of people's lives as being the experts in this work. And so I think, how do we create sustainable change as a result of this work, so that it isn't just something that we do that allows someone to get tenure? No offense, but I do think that sometimes that's what happens, and then we forget about those people once we've gotten into the institution of academia. And how do we ensure that we continue to, move that work forward that's going to be best for the communities that have been part of the research. And also, maybe it's employment opportunities. Really am thoughtful, Jennifer, what you said is that, I think many of us have felt that we have been the subjects of kind of a peekaboo, sort of traveling show, which can sometimes happen. But how do we, as stakeholders, get to control how our stories are shared, or how information about our experiences is disseminated in a way that allows us to continue to be centered as the experts in this work after the end of the project. So just something to think about.
I gave a talk a while ago. It's probably online somewhere. It was at a conference called Best Evidence versus Best Interests or Vested Interests, which was about how the evidence that gets attended to has very little to do with its truth or scientific credibility, and much more to do with whether it suits the power structure as it currently exists. So it's a frustrating thing about research. I've used research in a guerrilla fashion. I once attended a conference that was all about creating a certain type of very oppressive mental health service. I went and I was handing out articles that showed that this is unnecessary and harmful service until security removed me. Sort of proud of that. Probably hitting people over the head with research, but they can't say they didn't know it, and yet they carried on. So that's sort of discouraging note, but it is something you can rally around. The more noise people make about it, the harder it will be to ignore.
Mm-hmm. It's Maggie Soderling. You're looking at advancing public policy. People have to own this. People have to own that we all have a responsibility for each other. They say it takes a village to raise a child. It does. It takes a village. So there has to be that everyone's desire to promote positive change, to be inclusive. Policy is only, part of it. It's the implementation of that policy. It's the action of that policy. And I'm well known in my field for approaching politicians and holding them accountable. But the policies, are only as good as the implementation and the action of those policies, and more engagement of individuals, more engagements of people like yourselves that are speaking here tonight. I've been very impressed with both of you. I've learned a lot. I live it every day. I continually get quite annoyed when someone says, "Oh, don't worry about what they said." Well, I didn't hear it, and I would like to have heard that. So for me, it's a frustration every day, as I'm sure everyone who lives with barriers to living independently. And I think the policy has to be changed, and it has to be in action. If I look back at 2005, when we thought we were changing the world and AODA was in place, it didn't have teeth. David Leposki and I said there's nothing enforceable. Honestly, nobody gives a damn. They need to. People need to care. And that's how we're going to make change. There shouldn't be any question when we go into any environment, whether there's a ramp there, whether there's large print, whether there's an accessible environment. It should just be what we do as humans. And so for me, yes, I think the big question was advancing public policy. That's a big question.
I'm so grateful to you all. What a deep and rich conversation around really a set of calls to action. I feel really humbled by this idea around the way in which we need to own this. We need to take responsibility. Maybe I'll just start by expressing my sincerest gratitude for you three for joining us today and sharing your insight. I do feel really good about wrapping up our discussion here, unless anyone has any final thoughts and pivoting to the Q&A. How do you three feel about that? Is that okay?
It's fine with me.
Wonderful. So maybe I'll give everyone a moment to overcome that awkward moment of thinking about your question. And if you want to pose a question directly, there is a reaction button at the bottom of the screen you can use to raise your hand, and you can be unmuted, and if you don't mind, spotlit to pose that question. While you are thinking that through, I might turn to the chat history and read aloud. And I'll just note that I'm so grateful to everyone for such a rich discussion in the chat. What an engaged and thoughtful audience. I think, let's see if I can find it. One question was for Fran at the start. How can one implement being involved in communities and studies as a disabled person themselves to shift the narrative, as Fran mentioned at the start, without having a research degree? Like how do you get involved without touching that ivory tower, without having, you know, the credentials?
Ooh, that's a good question. You know, I mean, I don't have a research degree. My background is in social work. And I, you know, actively moved away from doing direct service after, you know, finishing my program. But I think really is networking. I mean, I hate to say it, but it is really about networking. It is about having yourself at the tables that you can be at to say, I'm interested, I want to know more, I can contribute. And I think it's really about challenging this idea that you have to have this degree in order to be credible. And I think, you know, this conversation tonight is really having us think and challenge that idea. So I really appreciate for Sarah that comment and question.
One thing I forgot to mention is that funders make a big difference in what kind of research gets done and how it's done. And lately, some funders have been requiring community involvement, which is fabulous. And so pressuring all funders to require some involvement of communities being studied would be very helpful. It also means that there's more opportunities to participate in research. You could, there's some centers of research that do elicit to people who want to be volunteers as well. Although I rather think that often involves being studied than participating in the research.
I love this question, being from the perspective of someone who doesn't have like those really important credentials to be taken seriously in the field. It sounds like there's some ways to like network and advocate for yourself. And then I also think that it's good for non-disabled researchers interested in this field to pay attention to this discussion, because there's a responsibility for the gatekeepers to open up the gates and to make sure those funding opportunities are being used in all the best and most well-intentioned ways.
You have to really avoid them being tokenistic involvement.
Yeah.
Which happens a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. We have to really think about like what meaningful inclusion looks like, and tokenism is an idea in at least our field that speaks to the ways in which, especially multiply marginalized people, are called on to be kind of mascots and end up entirely burnt out and stretched thin when they're called upon to do that work, and not necessarily there because they're expected or thought to be like meaningful contributors whose labor needs to be remunerated and whose time needs to be respected. Great. I'm very happy to leave that question there. If anyone has thought about a question they want to ask by raising their hand, I can yield the floor to you, but I also have another question in the chat I could turn to. Let's do that. So another question was, should academia determine academic research and community determine community-based research? Are the two intertwined? Are they independent? Are they, always ever in conflict? And is the purpose of academia to serve community, or is it at a cross purpose?
I put in the chat that I thought it was kind of a false dichotomy, because I think everyone in academia is a member of the community, whether they acknowledge their community influence on themselves or not. So it's really a matter of making choices that are visible, I think, and being open about sort of what you as a researcher, who you are, what you're bringing to the research, and the same with everybody who's involved with research. So I think we can't really separate the two.
I'm wondering as well, building on what you're saying, Jennifer, is that I think academia has a responsibility to think about the power that comes with being in an institution. And, who really is going to benefit from the research? Wouldn't it be great if stakeholders within academia pushed back and said, we really need to, have this be community-led, have this money be, put into the community rather than back into the institution. And I think that's where we can look at sort of challenging the power and thinking about allyship, even as researchers in particular settings.
Wonderful. Just playing with the tech. Here we go. What lovely contributions to what was, I think, like a sort of philosophical and incredibly thoughtful question. I do have a very practical question, I think, for Maggie. Would you care to elaborate on what it means to say that writing doesn't work with most hard of hearing people?
So when I'm talking about a culturally deaf individual, ASL is their first language. And yes, most people who are deaf and go to Gallaudet University or graduate from schools can read, but English is their second language. So it is a struggle. And I can't take ASL and I can't put it really into sentences. It's more of a picture. It has syntax and grammar like English does, but it's a visual language. Hard of hearing, absolutely. If a person is raised in a school and they have audio supports and they've been able to hear, they can obviously read and they can process that. If you look at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C., it's the best experience anyone could ever go to. Everything in that university is done in ASL, strict ASL. You walk through the halls and you can actually see the conversations just in front of you. It comes into pictures. You don't hear a lot of noise. You might hear a bit of laughing. So ASL is a very genuine, beautiful language, but it is not one that somebody can write out. I can sign it for sure. But hard of hearing, absolutely. If you're raised in an environment where you've been taught English and you can read and write, absolutely. When we look at the translation of the COVID material, I mean, the registry of this information that came out was such a high registry, some of us couldn't even understand it. So we need to bring down the register so that everyone can understand it. And then taking that English and then signing that you could just see the pictures come out. You could see how, oh, now I understand COVID because I can see it. It's a beautiful language. You can tell I'm very passionate about it.
Thanks so much, Maggie. That's really a really helpful primer, and so deeply important when we think about access to healthcare, given that I know this is a transnational audience, but in the Canadian context, it's like a constitutionally embedded right to have access to ASL in order to have proper healthcare services. And yet medical institutions still really struggle with offering that service.
One thing I want to add too is I've been working with the Elder Abuse Prevention Network for many years. And when I volunteered with them, we had a great relationship. I was actually a facilitator and I presented throughout Ontario. When COVID hit, I asked them to start thinking about all of their educational webinars to have them translated into ASL. And Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario, to this day, 99% of their webinars and educational material is all done in ASL. I've had people from all over the world send me emails thanking me about the information they've learned about elder abuse or frauds or scams or the grandparent scams, things that they had no idea. And these were very professional people throughout the world. And so what I say around accessibility is hats off to agencies like Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario for doing what was just the right thing to do and how they opened that up. And it then did not become a struggle for people to understand that elder abuse really happens and ageism is very prevalent. So there's an example of an agency who has government funding, but they're not heavily funded, that then can produce this information out in ASL. And every workshop we attend, there's people from, there was one workshop, there was over 600 people in attendance.
Amazing. It strikes me that Jennifer and Fran might know this well too, given that their research is situated in anti-violence work. Like if we're going to do work on ending violence, that material needs to be communicated, needs to be able to access communities in need of that data. And that means that we have to really think about communication as a kind of access barrier that can be life or death.
In a related topic, something that can give knowledge more punch is if people sort of form coalitions and are allies to each other. So some of the anti-use of force work I've done has involved letting people know what their rights are in relation to police. So this isn't exactly research related, but it could be applied similarly. And unfortunately, the way that some racialized communities have experienced racism is with implications that they are of lesser intelligence. So I was advocating for plain language because a lot of people have learning disabilities. A lot of people don't have English as a first language. A lot of reasons to do that, but it was received as sort of insulting to some of my allies. So it was challenging. And I ended up sort of losing the battle for plain language at the beginning and until it became apparent that it was in fact necessary. So I'm sure that everybody with disabilities has experienced this. There's a cross sections with all sorts of different communities. And of course, I have always areas of insensitivity that I need to be educated about. So if we want to do sort of broad impact work, we need to try and think broadly and try and bring our allies around, but it can be sometimes quite devastating. When you think you're in a sort of friendly place and discover you have to defend yourself there too.
Thank you so much for sharing that challenge. I find when we encounter these kinds of challenges in research and advocacy, it's at least always instructive so that those after us can do better or learn from those barriers. We have 5 minutes remaining. I do have one sort of policy question with apologies, because I just noticed, and I'm excited to see that there are people from Ghana and Australia fighting the time difference to be here. That's amazing. But we did get a question that maybe we can engage with quickly, and it's policy based. I was under the impression that Ontario was significantly better than Alberta when looking at inclusion, given the AODA. Am I misinformed? And I'm also curious to hear panelists' thoughts on the new Federal Accessibility Act in Canada. Any thoughts on federal and provincial policy in the Canadian context?
So it's Maggie. So the federal policy, they did recognize ASL as an official language. That was a big step forward. So that's going to hopefully break down some barriers. I don't know about Alberta's accessibility, but I know for me, as someone, living with a disability and trying to access services in Ontario, we're nowhere near an equal level playing field. We have much, much more to learn, much, much more to do, and much more action to put into place. The problem with the AODA legislation, it has no teeth. It doesn't really matter. People are not expected to do this or expected to do that. There's a goal by the year, whatever. Oh, let's be more accessible. But I want to go back to my original point that we have to internalize this as the village and raising this community. We have to be accessible. And accessible just makes sense for everyone. When I worked at CHS, I always told my staff, do not give people a clipboard and ask them to fill out their intake. Give them the clipboard and say, there's an intake. Would you like me to fill it out with you, or would you like to fill it out yourself? I would say about 80% of the people asked for help filling out that form. It's just an accommodation. So accessibility has to be, living, walking, being, doing. I can't compare to Alberta, but I know we have a long way to go with our accessibility in Ontario. As long as I'm above the ground and I have breadth, I will fight every day for removal of barriers and to break down the barriers for accessibility.
Can I really appreciate, Maggie, your comment, and I can't honestly comment on the Alberta either. But I think I'm also really thoughtful, and so it's 2025, folks. So we will have utopia in 3 years. Just the clock is ticking, and I say that with tongue in cheek, but quite honestly, like that was back in 2005, and we all, I think, had slight moments of hope that we might get a little bit closer. But we are now in 2022, and we aren't close, not even remotely. And how disconcerting and disappointing that is as somebody who has been doing this work for a long time, as all of us have been doing, and folks in the room as well. So I think, what I'm also reminded of is thinking about disability outside of the Canadian or North American context. And that, I am reminded that we have it actually pretty good compared to other communities where disabled people, deaf communities aren't even on the radar of government, aren't even on the radar of what it means to be human. So, I think that's also, a reminder, not to say, okay, well, this is as good as it gets, but to also, remember we're going to be working with communities that are migrating from outside of Canada who can't believe what we have. And it's almost a gift. So, it's really interesting to sort of keep that in context as we have this conversation.
And with the Ontario Advocacy Coalition, Fran, brief moment of glory.
Oh, goodness. Thank you so much for that discussion. I might close off the Q&A now with one more final question. Someone did ask whether you are reachable, whether you want to share your contact information. I'm not sure how to do that, whether you're comfortable putting it in the chat. I can also facilitate access if you want to send me an email, and I can direct audience members. I can leave that to the panelists to decide. And then in the moments remaining, I'll just note that bear with us. We're still adding content, but I've put in the chat the Eventbrite registration page for our November 2nd event. If you're interested in joining our third installment, you can register free of charge for the event link. And hopefully I will see everyone there. Thank you everybody for joining us today for what was really a moving discussion for me personally and professionally. I loved sharing space with you all.
Thanks, Fran and Maggie, and for the opportunity, Jen.
Yes, thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah,
People
thank
being here
you.
from-
It was great to be
People
part of
being
it.
here from all over the world too. That's amazing.
That's true. And everyone have a lovely morning, afternoon, or evening.
Yeah. Thanks to the interpreters and the captionists.
Indeed. I'm so grateful for the service providers who made this event accessible.
Bye-bye.
I'm going to stop recording.